If you're involved in city or county business, if that's your role or responsibility, please stand up.
There you are.
Ask that a round of applause for our city and county leaders, and really appreciate you being here today. That shows that you're interested in these topics and which are really important to our state. And I also want to thank Leslie for taking on being the president of the Western Dakota Energy Association. And Jeff Simon, your direction and leadership of this group has been outstanding. I think Load Pass and Wise Roads are just great examples of an association for counties that's actually making incredible progress. We have more tools available to us today than we did at the beginning of the Bakken boom, and it's just, I really appreciate that very much. I'm going to talk about methane today, and then John's going to talk about CO2 and enhanced oil recovery. I'm going to give you some information as to why the topic of methane is so important to the state of North Dakota. And before that, just a little bit of a story why it's just personally important to me. Recently sold my house in Williston and moved up to Divide County, so I'm a Divide County resident today, and we live on the family farm up there. We're getting to see a beginning of a little Bakken boom in that Tier 3 acreage up there. My father-in-law back in 2008 signed a lease that was never drilled. Today he's signing some leases that look like they're definitely going to be drilled. I'm going to talk about methane regulations that are going to hit us in about 5 years. And yeah, as a resident up in that area, I don't particularly own minerals up there, but all our neighbors do. And we want to see continued development. And I'm going to be talking about regulations that are coming into play that put some constraints on our ability to drill wildcat wells and get into undeveloped areas of oil and gas development. I'm going to talk about why oil and gas development is important to the U.S. In particular, up in Divide County, we're in the midst of building a gas plant, and we need to get that gas plant done so that we can comply with these regulations. And I think business decisions would be a bit different if we were standing here 5 years from now looking at trying to develop Tier 3 acreage where you have to produce 10 barrels of water for every barrel of oil. It's a different part of the Bakken, but a very important part, and very important to the landowners in that area. So, just a few days ago, the Supreme Court ruled that we're going to continue business as usual with the EPA methane regulations as written. So a stay was not honored by motions on behalf of states and industry groups to put a stay until litigation can be settled. So what this means is that lower court process is going to occur over years. That we could rely maybe on the federal Congress to intervene, but that again is going to be years. State legislatures under the new methane rules will have to be making decisions over about a 2-year period on how the states are going to enforce what the federal government laid out. So that is occurring, and industry, our only option in industry is compliance and innovation. And at the end of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about some innovation that's occurring. On the legal front, a little bit of the details. Oklahoma has brought a suit, Texas has brought a suit, API has brought a suit. The bottom two are suits brought by the environmental groups that say the methane rules don't go far enough. But the state's argument is this is an overreach of federal authority. It has an economic impact, and it's a state sovereignty issue. So, why are we going down this pathway? What you'll hear in the news is that methane is more potent than carbon dioxide. Now, what that means is that there's something what we call global warming potential. So methane is 20 times greater than the effect of CO2's global warming potential, being the baseline CO2's global warming potential over a 100-year lifetime. In the upper right-hand corner of the pie chart in the upper right-hand corner, what's being shown there is greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. in 2022, and the contribution of CO2 and methane and fluorocarbons and things like refrigerants to climate change, and what role methane plays in global or greenhouse gases, and the methane in this pie chart is on a CO2 equivalent basis. So that's taking into account the 28 times global warming potential of methane. Down in the bottom corner is a pie chart of the methane emissions in the U.S. and what role oil and gas plays in those methane emissions. And you'll see, 50% of that pie is agriculture and industry, the two things that we mainly export from this state and work really hard on. So other facts, so methane only accounts for 11.1% of greenhouse gases. Its lifetime is about 12 years in the atmosphere, but again, when it's emitted at that higher intensity relative to CO2, which lifetime in the atmosphere is over thousands of years. The role oil and gas has played in our country over time. This chart is showing both gas production and oil production, and a drastic increase in about the year 2008, and this is all due to our technology and our ability to exploit what we call unconventional oil and gas sources. So that's tight shale on the East Coast in the Marcellus. That is tight oil in the Bakken. It's our ability to pump fluids in the ground, make cracks in rock, and flow those fluids to the wellbore and get them to the surface. Our ability to do that, our technology discovery in that area, and our ability to get better at it creates the energy security and the economy in the U.S. and our ability to export oil and gas to our allies. So, what is the hubbub on federal government methane rules? Our oil and gas industry, prior to methane rules, operated under what we call Quad O and Quad OA. What that means is that each well pad that's out there, as an industry, we ensure that those well pads are producing under 100 tons per year of criteria pollutants, in that they don't require a typical federal air emissions permit like a large power plant, say a coal-fired power plant would. And then, the rules work through the state on the various compliance issues. Quad OA is mainly focused around VOCs, volatile organic compounds, H2S, and other gases, and is based on a per tank emission rate. If you're over that emission rate, then you fall under federal guidelines and you have to have controls according to the federal government. So that's largely the world we lived in prior to the promulgation of the methane rules, which are designated under Quad OB and Quad OC. The primary designation here is that Quad OB are for new modified sources, new or modified, and Quad OC pertains to existing sources. And Quad OB, we're living that right now this year. Quad OC, there's yet to be determined, and a lot will depend on how the states enforce the federal government rules. So, what is packed into this? Well, there's a number of things here. Number one, there's a super emitter program. That program is designed to deputize organizations that can be certified through the EPA, take measurements on well pad facilities, and if they see something over 100 kilograms per hour, report it to the federal government. And there's all kind of rules on time to respond and how the industry deals with that. I point that one out because I don't think I've ever seen something like this in federal air pollution control or state air pollution control requirements ever. No routine flaring, so we're looking out towards, say, May 7th, 2026, that we will no longer be able to do what's called routine flaring. We'll still be allowed to have emergency emissions to flare, that kind of thing. And just bear with me, these are very, very simplified versions of what's in the rules. We're looking at a methane penalty. So I guess you could say we're allowed to emit some methane, but we have to pay for it, and that dollar amount increases over time. Something that the industry has not had to deal with in the past, liquid loading requirements. This requires a best management plan submitted to the federal government. The liquid unloading requirements, this is every well pad facility in which a truck has to pull in and load and unload liquid into a tank battery. When a truck is, say, loading, the empty space in that truck typically vents to atmosphere, and there's typically hydrocarbons in that tank. So we're having to eliminate those emissions, control those emissions, have best management plans for every truck that goes in and out of a facility, and then record any venting events that occur. Zero emissions for pneumatic controls. A lot of facilities use the gas that's produced to power opening and closing valves. There's a lot of technology to improve that, but I would just put it this way, the old technology would emit a little puff of gas when it goes to actuate the valve. We're looking to completely do away with that. Again, I talked about storage tanks, but the 6 ton per year that was per tank, that's going to turn into a 6 ton per year per tank battery. So, you know, the rule going into effect now all of a sudden groups a lot of facilities that were not under federal control into federal control. We are to achieve a 95% methane reduction on well pads and tank batteries. And one of the kickers here in this rule is that when we talk about modified sources, it's not just a physical change of the facility that then constitutes a modification. If we drill a new well on the pad, if we refrac the well, if we drastically increase the oil flow through the facility, now that facility falls under Quad OB rules and is no longer an existing source. Plug and abandoning wells, there's a significant amount of documentation around that was not previously there. So we have to have closure plans and post-monitoring and reporting. One positive out of this set of Quad OB, Quad OC would be that leak detection and repair programs that are required under the rules, we can lessen the revisit to the sites to get that data with new technology. And all these rules don't just apply to well pads, they apply to midstream facilities, so compressor stations and all these facilities fall under Quad OB and Quad OC. So that's just a picture of what we're looking at. And again, what I said is the industry is looking at innovation and compliance with these rules. Okay, so EERC, what are we doing around this? We have a technology called Polar Bear that has to do with reducing flaring. We named it this because the polar bear is an icon of being robust, adaptive, and environmentally sensitive. why we went down this pathway and what we're looking at. This is the gas production and flaring history in North Dakota. So the blue line is gas production. The orange line is flaring. The X's are North Dakota's regulatory approach to gas capture and what those goals were set over time, becoming more stringent over time. And the gray dots is the industry's performance. And so the industry has largely kept up with the gas capture rules set by the state. And today we're at 5% flaring. Understanding this and understanding where that 5% gas is being produced and how to reduce that flaring is what Polar Bear is about. Some other aspects of that volume of gas that's being flared, number one, it's not stranded. So the bulk of the volume is not coming from wells that say have no pipeline outlet. Most wells connected to a pipeline are flaring some gas, and that's the volume that we have to chase to go after that 5%. Also, I don't expect you to understand the graphics, just understand the points. The middle graphic is showing some data that a lot of that gas is coming from what we call a single central tank battery. So the way to think about that is, say, single wells versus a giant well pad, and that the flaring is coming from wells that actually don't flare a lot of gas. So it's these wells that flare, say, less than 10% of their gas in aggregate across the state. That's where that volume is. All of this data points to a very economically challenged situation to capture gas, and that's why we needed new technology. So this is just showing some past work. I'll say today we've gotten 8 patents on this technology. We're working with a local North Dakota manufacturer, and we've worked to get our suppliers in place. We're building first units, and we hope to roll them out this year. But what this is gas can be captured through what we call conventional vapor recovery. Those machines are not designed to be as nimble as we need them to be to go after this aggregate market of small volume gas. So what we're doing here is innovating in the compressor space, lowering costs, having machines that don't require oil changes, and being able to go after that gas in an economic way. iPipe is another program that we operate, EERC. We have 6 operators in this program. We've been doing a whole host of projects. What you should know about iPipe is that we invested heavily in satellite technology. We have 1 major operator using that technology in the state, and what we're able to discern from that work is that we're finding the leaks first. So no longer is the landowner the first line of defense in this equation. Through this technology, we find the leaks first, and we find the leaks that you can't normally see. So a lot of pipelines have computational pipeline monitoring technology on them, but a really tiny pinhole leak is something that won't be picked up in that data. And with satellite technology, we can see that leak. Oftentimes we'll send a guy out in the field and he'll look and he can't see it. And then we go out and do a dig where that satellite said to do a dig, and lo and behold, there's a pinhole leak. So this is happening right now in North Dakota. It is a giant leap forward in leak detection technology, and it was all due to iPipe. One other thing that we've done in our second phase of funding is we worked with a company that does computational pipeline monitoring with advanced AI and can really see leaks well beyond a conventional computational method. And they've deployed that technology on oil lines. It's been commercial on oil lines, but had not been deployed on produced water lines. And we were able to get that technology out on produced water lines. Today, the company is using that on 3 major produced water lines in the state, with more to come. And they said they would never been able to do that without the iPipe funding. They wouldn't even have thought about doing produced water. So we were able to bring that through. This is our iPipe 3.0 program. I'll just point to the last 3 projects here on this list. They're all about methane. They're all about getting aerial technology to detect methane, and not just detect it, but to quantify it, and then be able to provide that as a leak detection and repair for the companies, and innovate according to those Quad OB and Quad OC regulations. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to John to talk about some more interesting stuff.
All right, well, thanks, Darren. So Darren had the pleasure of talking about how EERC is working with our federal and state programs to help industry implement solutions to increasing federal regulations. I have the pleasure to talk a bit more about some of the other work and the broader work that EERC is doing and how it's helping to enable energy production within North Dakota. So I'll start out by talking a little bit about North Dakota itself, and we are a state of energy. We are the 3rd largest oil and gas producer in the U.S. We're 7th in coal, 6th in wind, 10th in ethanol, and 10th in natural gas. So overall, we are the 8th largest energy producer in the U.S., and we are a net energy exporter. For every unit of energy we produce, we send 6 more out to the U.S. to be used other places. But it takes a lot of energy to make energy. We're also number 3, or the 3rd highest in terms of total energy consumed per capita, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, we have a small population, but even more so, making energy is one of the highest energy uses for any form of energy. So it takes a lot of energy to run our coal and natural gas generating power plants and mining coal to make electricity for the world and for the U.S. It takes a lot of energy to build and install wind turbines. It takes a lot of energy to drill and produce and compress gas and refine oil and sell it to the market. So states like California and Minnesota and New York can say they have a lot lower energy consumption per capita because they're bringing their energy in from other places like North Dakota, Wyoming, Texas, and Louisiana. So what that means is that we're under increased scrutiny in terms of federal regulations, looking at emissions, and increased public and more susceptible to those regulations because we're energy producers and energy exporters, and we're also under increasing public scrutiny for the world. Now, North Dakota also has some opportunity here because we have a workable regulatory environment that we've maintained in the state, a business-friendly culture, and ability to manage carbon. We also have some opportunities to continue to supply and export power to the U.S. and products to the world. So I'm going to talk about a few things, but first I want to talk about the Bakken and just really how big this resource is. So since 1859, there's been about 250 billion barrels of oil produced from U.S. oil fields. That's the cumulative production since 1859. To put the Bakken in perspective, oil in place estimates are between 100 billion and 900 billion barrels of oil. So arguably, there's more oil in the Bakken system in North Dakota under our feet than the entire cumulative production of U.S. oil fields in the last 150 years. And so that's a tremendous amount of resource. And so as we talk about investing in research, investing in how do we get the next 1, 2, 10% of oil out of the ground, recognize that the entire U.S. oil and gas industry is premised and was built on production that's equal to about the amount of oil that's in the ground in the Bakken. And so I took a middle-of-the-road estimate, and let's just assume there's 400 billion barrels of oil in the Bakken. That's between that 100 and 900 billion barrel of oil estimate. As Preston mentioned this morning in his presentation, to date, we've produced about 5 billion barrels of oil under primary production. So primary production is drilling wells, horizontal wells, hydraulically fracturing them, producing them. They start at high rates, they decline fairly rapidly, and you produce them till the end of their economic limit, and then ultimately you'd shut them in. Depending on what we heard from Justin, depending on how the economics play out, and Preston talked about this as well, we think, and I'm going to skip a couple slides because we're coming up on time, but we think that when it's all said and done, primary production will likely produce somewhere between 10 and 20 billion barrels of oil out of the Bakken. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at the EERC is working with federal research programs, working with state research programs, and working with energy producers and oil and gas companies to figure out how do we get that next 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion barrels of oil out of the ground. I grew up in Williston, North Dakota. When I graduated in 2001, most of my classmates, as we were going out and getting degrees and going out in the workforce, it was unlikely that we would be able to find a job back in North Dakota. Because of the oil and gas industry, I'm able to live, I'm able to work and raise a family in the state. And because of the innovation we've seen in the industry, my kids will have that same opportunity. What we're working on the research side is to give those same opportunities to my grandkids who haven't yet been born. So some of the areas that we're working on, Darren mentioned a couple of programs. We're also working on something called the Bakken Production Optimization Program that has most of the major oil and gas producers in North Dakota as members. So these are looking at near-term opportunities and addressing near-term challenges. We're looking at things like value-added gas, re-stimulation of Bakken wells, so going in and refracturing them to bring their production back up. Looking at how we manage produced water and maintenance on wells so that we can lower lease operating expenses and extend the productive life of those wells, and things like surfactant. In the midterm, we're looking on some bigger picture items like rich gas and CO2 enhanced oil recovery that might be able to add billions of barrels or tens of billions of barrels and generations to the Bakken play. And then way out there, we have what's called our State Energy Research Center, which our legislature had allocated and appropriated some dollars for EERC to work with other education industries throughout, or education institutions throughout North Dakota to look at technologies that may not even be conceived yet today and may take years to commercialize, but to start now so that they're available so that my kids and grandkids can start looking at how are they implemented when it's their turn. So let's start. We heard some discussion on the panel earlier that Brady teed up about enhanced oil recovery. So let me start here. And this is something that we at EERC have been working on for about a decade. And as Preston mentioned, it takes time to develop and mature technologies that can result in tens of billions of barrels of oil. So we started working through laboratory work, through modeling, and through field pilots with companies like XTO and Liberty Resources. We're seeing additional field pilots now by Hess and Continental and others, and we've been able to have some pretty significant accomplishments thus far. When we started, we weren't sure that EOR was even a possibility in tight unconventionals like a Bakken, but we've had a lot of technical success since then. We've been able to show that both rich gas, or gas produced from the Bakken, which is about 70% methane, 20% ethane, 10% propane, and CO2 behave very, very similarly for EOR under Bakken conditions. So what we know is if one works, the other is likely to as well. And it's not a one or the other. We've also learned that you can mix and match, and you can potentially spike CO2 with rich gas to get to higher volumes or take advantage of some certain properties that rich gas may have relative to CO2. We've also learned through field pilots that we can inject CO2 and rich gas into the Bakken formation. We've learned that within a DSU, we can inject enough gas in a depleted area of the Bakken where the pressure has been reduced by years of production, and we can rebuild that pressure back to closer to original reservoir pressures in order to push more oil out. We've learned that in addition to that, we've learned that we can mobilize oil that would not have otherwise been mobilized from the Bakken. So in other words, we know that by introducing rich gas or CO2, we can move oil that would not have otherwise came out of the formation and produce it. We've been able to show that we can produce incremental oil. So in other words, we can produce more oil through these pilots and these tests than what would have otherwise been produced out of these units. And we've demonstrated technology that has reduced the compression and injection cost of CO2 EOR. So we're systematically moving through technical success after technical success, working in the lab, working through modeling, and working through field tests with Bakken producers. And I think we're very, very close to the first commercial success. And as Preston talked about this morning, it took us until 2004 to have our first commercial well, Bakken well, in North Dakota. But as soon as we had the economics of that well, investment and innovation in industry has taken those first early producers to wells today that are producing just massive amounts of oil because they've innovated and they got better over time. So along those lines, recently we were able to work with Cord Energy, the North Dakota Oil and Gas Research Program, and the U.S. Department of Energy were successful in getting over $11 million from the Department of Energy to work on a Bakken CO2 EOR and storage field lab. And this is really designed to execute an 18-month CO2 injection pilot for the purpose of EOR and associated storage. So understanding how much CO2 is stored as part of the process, is there incremental value that can be derived in economics from injecting that CO2, and what does that do to the carbon intensity of the oil? And could you be producing lower carbon intensity oil that has incremental value when it's being sold? And so this is going to be the first large, what I consider truly large scale EOR pilot in the state, and I think it's going to get us very close to, ideally, if what's expected, it's going to get us close to our first, what I think would be our first commercial EOR pilot. And so if we do this right, and if we're able to unlock EOR in North Dakota, we can add 20 plus years of production. We think that based on initial estimates, we'll need somewhere between 1 and 3 or maybe even 5 billion tons of CO2 to fully commercialize. And we could produce somewhere between 3 to 7 to 10 billion barrels or more of incremental oil. But there is a little bit of a rub. We don't have enough rich gas and CO2 to fully scale up EOR in the Bakken. Based on the volumes that we think we're going to need, based on modeling some of the initial tests, we think that if we took all the rich gas and all the CO2 from all the point sources in the state, put capture on it, transportation, compression, we'd have about 30 million tons of CO2 and several million tons of rich gas. If we're going to replace that primary production decline, so once all the primary production, all the wells are drilled out in that Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 acreage, we think that we'll start, because of the production decline on oil and gas wells, we'll go from 1.2, 1.3 million barrels of oil a day to 1.1 to 1 million to 900 to 800,000. To replace that, once we've fully through primary production, which may be a decade to 2 decades out, we think we're going to need 5 times more CO2 than North Dakota currently produces in order to just offset that production decline. So that's why we're starting to work on solutions now, so that we can have the technology, we can have the supply, we can have the infrastructure in place, so that we have it when we're ready for it to offset that production decline. And so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how CCS, carbon capture and storage, plays a role in all this. And we're seeing CCS as being able to provide for robust, resilient, reliable, affordable, safe, clean energy. Just like Darren talked about in new methane rules, our power production industry is facing the same thing. There's new EPA rules that came out this year that for existing and new coal-fired power generation and new gas generation, stating that that thou must have carbon capture storage implemented by 2032, or they can be shut down by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. Now, there's lawsuits. There hopefully or will likely be injunctions to help stay those rules. But if we're going to keep producing energy in North Dakota from our coal resources, if we're going to keep producing energy both in-state from natural gas power generation and selling natural gas generation out of state, this is a way to help do that. Yes?
Just like the methane rules in oil and gas, rules for existing power plants by 2032, the Supreme Court refused to stay that also, so North Dakota plants need to start applying the process.
Yeah, great comment. So what he said is that similarly the Supreme Court stayed the new 111B and D rules on existing and new power generation. So similar to the methane rules, that puts it in a much longer process and adds uncertainty for years to come. And so this is why we're looking at CCS as an important part to continue to produce energy from our North Dakota resources. Now, we also think it can provide enhanced value to North Dakota products if we do it right. So now we're looking at, well, where do we get that CO2 and how do we compete for it? So this map shows where the current CCS projects are within the central, interior, and west coast of the U.S. and Canada. You see existing capture projects, existing EOR projects, existing pipelines, as well as ongoing carbon storage projects and announced projects that have been announced and are under development. Now, a comment that we're hearing a lot, and it was talked about this morning a little bit, I believe by Danette as well, is around CCS. And there's a lot of, I think, uncertainty that you hear in terms of, well, do we know enough information about it? Is it safe? Are there examples? And so taking a look at this region, there's been over 150 million tons of CO2 that have been captured and stored and used for EOR in Montana, Wyoming, Saskatchewan, and North Dakota is the most recent member of that club. We've been capturing CO2 in North Dakota for close to 25 years and sending it to pipeline and exporting it to the Weyburn and Rydale oil fields in Saskatchewan. We've captured and transported more than 40 million tons of CO2, and that oil field has produced over 100 million barrels of incremental oil because of it. Likewise, Wyoming has been capturing CO2 for close to 40 years and using it for enhanced oil recovery as well. Close to 100 million tons of CO2 has been captured, and several hundred million tons of barrels of incremental oil have been produced in Wyoming. We're also North Dakota, and for the first time in 2022, North Dakota started importing CO2 from Wyoming for our first CO2 EOR floods in Cedar Hills Field and Cedar Creek Anaconda in Bowman County. So we're finally getting into the game as well. North Dakota is also capturing CO2 for storage on several of our ethanol plants and gasification facilities, and as I'm sure you've heard, there's other projects that have been announced. So why does capture and storage matter? Well, much of the annual CO2 supply being targeted for capture and storage today could be available for EOR in the future, in the next decade or two, once we're ready for it, in the Bakken. So there's current tax credits, and right now the tax credits are higher for storage than it is for EOR. But if the EOR credits were lifted to be competitive with storage, or when those credits sunset in 12 years, so after they've paid for the business case for capture, compression, and transportation, 12 years from the start of the project, or if those EOR credits are raised, that CO2 now may be able to be used for EOR. So we'll have the capture, we could potentially have the capture and infrastructure in place. So we're also seeing CCS and carbon management as a means of driving some industry in North Dakota. The ethanol industry, there's several ethanol plants that have implemented carbon capture and storage in order to reduce the carbon intensity of the ethanol that they produce. They did this because they can sell that ethanol to markets in California, Oregon, and Alberta and get a premium for that ethanol because those states and those provinces are looking at blending that ethanol into their fuels to create lower carbon fuel sources. As I mentioned, our coal-fired power generation and natural gas generation are looking at CCS as a way to hedge against these new rules that threaten to potentially shut these plants down unless they have a way to reduce their carbon intensity by over 90% by 2032. We're also seeing opportunities where historically our ag industry has been at the end of the line for fertilizer. It was produced in the Gulf Coast and railed up to North Dakota, and so in the spring during planting we were subject to supply disruptions, and we were subject to kind of the highest transportation costs in the country. We now have fertilizer plants looking at relocating to North Dakota or locating in North Dakota because of our availability of natural gas, our low-cost energy, and ability to store carbon associated with that process. Likewise, we have a GTL facility that's looking at coming into North Dakota to take Bakken-produced gas and NGLs and upgrade them to much higher value products like low sulfur diesel fuel and other chemical commodities that can be marketed to the world. And they're looking at North Dakota because we have abundant natural gas, low-cost energy, and the ability to manage carbon associated with that process, which is critical for them to sell into the markets that they want to. And so as we're looking at all this, we start seeing how this all might fit together to help us produce more oil. So I'm not going to talk much on this, but in addition to the Bakken, and I think Kathy Nessett's talking tomorrow, and and I know she likes talking about how North Dakota won the geologic jackpot. So the only thing I'll say is that North Dakota, in addition to the Bakken, has 20 additional hydrocarbon-bearing formations in the state, in various parts of the state. So we have a lot of oil that's yet untapped. We also have a tremendous CO2 storage potential. Resource estimates put between 100 to 200 billion plus, or the ability to store between 100 and 200 billion tons of CO2 in our deep saline formations. So in terms of other research, we're also looking at our conventional fields, like the Madison and Mission Canyon formations that produced most of the oil in North Dakota prior to the Bakken boom. And so if you take a look at this slide, on the right-hand side, you see a well log, and you see some shading there. Historically, you'd perf and produce that green shaded area in the top of the formation, and that's because oil tends to, within the pore space in the rock, tends to migrate to the top of the formation, and so you'd perf and you'd produce the oil off the top. If you perfed and tried to produce lower, you'd get a lot of water with a little bit of oil show in it. Now with modern technology, modern well logs, modern assessment, we're starting to realize that that orange area may have 20 or 30 or 40% oil saturation in it, but that oil is stuck to the rock and the water moves more easily in between it. So think about it, if you have a bunch of grease on your hand, you put it under a faucet, that water flows over the grease, it doesn't really wash it off. That's the same sort of thing, that oil is wetting the rock formation. But using modern technology like surfactants and CO2 EOR as a solvent, we think we can mobilize much more of this oil. And so instead of having 5 or 10 foot of producing horizon at 100% saturation, you might have an additional 70, 80, 90 feet of producing horizon at a 40% saturation. So there may be much more oil in these traditional plays than we had previously recognized. And so we're working through the North Dakota Oil and Gas Research Program with a Williston Basin producer in order to go out and evaluate residual oil zone and production potential in these ROZs, and then ultimately field test different techniques to recover it. And if we're successful, we think these same techniques will be able to be applied to potentially Mission Canyon, Madison fields throughout North Dakota. So I think I'm coming up on break time, so I'm going to go kind of quickly through these next slides, unless Jeff tells me to jump off the stage now, but it looks like they're maybe still getting set up. So another area we're looking at is salt caverns. And so what a salt cavern is, underneath in the Williston Basin, there are formations like the Bakken formation, but they're pure salt. And so if you drill a well in them, you inject water, you'll dissolve that salt, and you'll make a cavern or a cave that's self-sealing. Why this matters is that salt caverns are like grain bins for hydrocarbon stored products and like gas tanks for feedstocks for the petrochemical industry. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but EERC, through some legislatively directed funding, took a look at potential for salt caverns within North Dakota. And we looked at where those salts occur within the Williston Basin, where are they deep enough but not too deep to have the geomechanical properties in order to be able to solution mine them and hold up long-term for product storage. And what we found on those green maps is that they're pretty prevalent throughout a lot of the western part of the state. Now, salt caverns are used extensively in places like the Gulf Coast and Michigan and Illinois for product storage, where they have really thick salts. They may be 700, 800, 900, 1,000 feet thick. Our salts in North Dakota are probably closer to 50 to 100 feet. So how we engineer them, how we solution mine them, how we use them might look a little different, but based on our initial work, we think there's potential application there. So why they matter, the high NGL content in Bakken gas, so ethane, propane, butane, provides an opportunity for feedstocks for petrochemical industry, like gas to liquids facilities. But those facilities don't like to turn on or off or ramp up or ramp down, so you need a big gas tank to act as a reserve for these products so that you're not worrying about supply disruptions. The other thing we can do is that we can use them for NGL storage and hydrocarbon product storage to help address some of the limitations on pipeline export capacity, or if you're pushing up on BTU limits because our natural gas that we produce in the Bakken has high energy content, or to allow producers to take advantage of markets, just like they do in the Gulf Coast and Illinois and Michigan. So if you have think of like the ag industry. If you're harvesting wheat, if you don't have a grain bin, you have to sell it at the time of harvest, and you're stuck with the price at that time. If you have a grain bin, you can wait until maybe the market's higher and sell those at highs and hold on to it while the prices are low. So these salt caverns could be a way to help, again, make North Dakota oil and gas more competitive with regions like the Gulf Coast. So this is actually, we drilled a first stratigraphic test well. We collected salt. This is some core that we collected from about 5,000 feet in depth in western North Dakota. And what you're looking at, that clear, is pure salt. That's pure halite. That's the same thing as table salt that we use for table salt from a formation. So based on testing, based on lab work, it gave us the confidence that these salt formations in western North Dakota, particularly the pine and Dunham salts, have properties that are conducive for salt cavern storage. So our next step is to work with our legislatively directed funding to take a look at de-risking salt cavern development with commercial partners. So it's working with those industries that may use them to understand what the various business cases are, working through the techno-economics, not just for developing the salt caverns, which may take $10 or $20 million, but also how do you build the vehicle around the gas tank, or how do you build the facility around the storage site and understand the techno-economic considerations. And if they're there, work with a commercial co-investment to develop our first salt cavern in North Dakota, to work through the engineering, to demonstrate that it's viable so that others can come along and behind and industry can take over. The final thing I'll talk about is critical minerals and rare earth elements, which is another active area that we're working in. And they're used in everything, and our modern life is 100% reliant on them. It's everything from computer chips to cars to medical devices to light bulbs to bicycles. The colonel that commands the Grand Forks Air Force Base last week let us know that the new F-35 fighter jets, the Gen 4 fighters, use close to 1,000 pounds of critical minerals and rare earth elements in those, so they're also vital to our national security. And right now, the U.S. is more than 50% reliant on mineral commodities from the countries highlighted on this map, including places like China and Russia. But we're lucky, we can at least produce some ourselves. China produces over 90% of the critical minerals and rare earth elements for the world. So we have an opportunity potentially to produce critical minerals, rare earth elements, not just for ourselves, for resiliency, but also supply them to our friends and allies throughout the world. And so this is a table, if I remember right, we used to use a lot in high school chemistry class. And we didn't use it all the time, but I think we used it periodically. That's my dad joke. But these, the elements that are bolded out here are what are considered critical elements, critical minerals, and rare earth elements. The ones highlighted in yellow are those that we think are potentially of commercial interest in the Williston Basin. And so EERC has been leading what's called the CORE-CM initiative. So the acronym is Carbon Ore, Rare Earth, Critical Mineral, CORE-CM. Now this is an initiative, there's 9 of these initiatives throughout the U.S. that are being funded through the Department of Energy. Ours that we're leading is focused on the Williston and Powder River Basin in North Dakota, Montana, and eastern Wyoming. We're partnered with universities, we're partnered with state agencies, we're partnered with trade associations, and we're partnered with commercial customers. And it's really about understanding potential for critical carbon ore, critical minerals, rare earth elements within the region. As part of this, we went out and sampled and assayed potential of occurrence and concentrations of critical minerals and rare earth elements in North Dakota's coal mines, in produced water from oil and gas, in drill cuttings, and other potential areas that could have some commercial viability. Now, typically, concentrations that are of potential commercial interest are on the order of 200 parts per million. Now that doesn't mean if you find them at 200 parts per million, you have a commercial project. Refining and concentration depends on impurities and other things, but generally once you hit that 200 part per million range, they start being of commercial interest. We found samples in North Dakota that are up to 2,000 parts per million. So much, much higher, and I don't have them highlighted on this map because there's some commercial development sensitivities around them, but if you look on the map, the bubble map, there's a lot that are over 200 parts per million. And so we've been working with UND to develop processes and look at how do we refine and how do we concentrate these materials out of North Dakota coals that are being mined for power generation. And we started out being able to produce grams and then pounds, and now we're able to produce tons. We've sent them off to commercial, and we're able to concentrate them from several hundred parts per million to 80 or 90% concentrated rare earth elements. We've sent them out to commercial refineries, and every sample they've said, these are commercially viable, we'll buy every piece of every sack of them that you can send us. And so we're not there yet, but this is a way where we might be able to add value add to our coal mining and power generation. We've also found that by extracting them, it beneficiates the coal, so it actually makes it burn and produce electricity better. So we can potentially add value to our coal mining and our power generation, and potentially add value to help offset some of the lease operating expenses if we can recover these out of our produced water from our oil and gas industry as well. So I really appreciate your time and being able to share a little bit about some of the work that the great people at myself and the great people at the EERC are doing. And thank you, Jeff, and everyone for giving us the opportunity to talk about what we're doing. So thank you.
Oh, questions?
Not for these guys, just for Chickenfoot?
Pardon?
You didn't have a question for these guys, just?
I was just talking to a pipeline guy.
Question for you. How far away are we
We'll just play
in
this
your
game
opinion?
anymore.
Because I know there's a lot of development and a lot of testing. And how far away are we actually going to see something, some kind of benefication of rare earths out of our living?
You know, we're a ways away, so we know where we're at today is we know we're there. We know they are there. We know there's critical minerals and rare earth elements that co-reside with coals that are mined in North Dakota. And we know within those coal seams where the highest concentrations are, or at least where some of the higher concentrations reside. We know that they can be concentrated through the process, and so we've proven that technically we can get there. Now what we need to do is better understand what is the total volume, or the total tonnage, or the total mass that are at each of these locations, and work with industry to attract industry that would actually come in, install the infrastructure, and do all the work and all the investment necessary to start refining those, and then also find a secure market. One of the challenges that the U.S. is always going to have, unless there's guaranteed pricing by the military or the federal government or somewhere else, the risk is that China could flood the market, drop prices, and all that investment goes for naught. So I think one of the key things we need to get in place is some sort of guaranteed pricing on these by selling them domestically to ourselves or friends and allies, in order to make sure to give confidence in that commercial investment to install the concentration and refining.
That was my next question. Is you need a market for it. And if we're serious about wanting to get independence from not necessarily friends around the world,
Yep.
why wouldn't the Department of Defense be the place to start for this?
I think I agree.
My question is, that last slide, you had a lot of those green spots. Those aren't active coal mines.
So some are active coal mines, others are coal seams that we sampled, so exposures or outcrops that we've sampled.
So most of this critical elements, are they minerals? Are they located only in cobalt, or? I mean, you could open a mining operation and it doesn't have to be a coal operation, right, to extract these?
Correct. So they can occur other places, and likely do occur other places. What we sampled, or primarily sampled, were coal mines and produced water from oil and gas, because that's where we have access to, pretty good distribution of different places throughout the state. And we looked at places where you're already aggregating somewhat large volumes of material, or handling large volumes of material. They could certainly be other places, and I think the North Dakota Geologic Survey had identified some in some of the clays, just some of the surface clays out in western North Dakota as well.
I mean, the argument can be made. I mean, a lot of those, you see the mining conditions like in Africa and places like that, a lot of this stuff be better mined in our area where it's regulated and you don't have slave labor basically extracting this. I mean, if you want to make an argument to the other side of the aisle, that's the argument to be made. I mean, to shift to, you know, have the regulations and the mining operations in our country.
Absolutely, absolutely, 100% agree with. I 100% agree with you. I think I may saw one more question in the back. Okay.
All right. All right, third time's a charm. Thank you very much.